Welcome back, everyone, to the Land Between the Meadows, a History of Kentucky podcast. I'm here today with Jim Rumford. It's a special occasion. We have our first author interview, and he is the author of Tobacco, Trust, and Trump, How America's Forgotten War Created Big Government. So, Mr. Rumford, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Jameson, how are you?
We're doing good. We're in a bit of a different situation than we would have expected. I've been out of contact with, or I should say I had all these plans. This week is my spring break week, so I had all these plans on meeting up with these people, recording them, and getting all this good, I guess, Kentucky history content, and that's all come to a halt. So everything's changed a little bit, but I'm real glad we're able to get together here over the internet. You know, technology does have its advantages at times.
It does.
So to start off, just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what connection you have to Kentucky.
Well, I was born in Louisville, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
My parents moved away from there in about a year or so later. This is during the war, World War II, World War II, not one. And the family's all from Bracken County, Kentucky, which is Brooksville, Augusta. Big tobacco farmers in that part of the country.
Oh, yeah.
And so I grew up in northern Kentucky, Cincinnati, and my parents moved to Dayton, Ohio when I was in high school. So that's kind of the track we went on. A lot of fond memories of Kentucky and Cincinnati growing up.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of time on the grandparents' tobacco farms, working on the farm as a little kid, being a nuisance. Walking behind my grandfather as he cultivated the tobacco crop. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I started working the tobacco crop, or tobacco fields, and grew up in that environment.
Well, and if for any listeners out there, I cannot get too much into the hard work of tobacco. I have when my father, he had a farm and tobacco and cows and all that kind of. He was a farmer, but when I was younger, but about the age of 5, he sold it all and what was done with tobaccoing. So the little tobacco work that I had put in, I can say is pretty difficult. Raising tobacco is not an easy chore by any means.
If you've never raised a crop of tobacco, you've never worked a day in your life.
Yeah, yes. And your book has a lot of examples of when you were young and working in tilling and man, one of the toughest things, and when I was reading your book, this really brought back the memories. It was, I guess you would call it de-weeding, or getting the weeds out of the tobacco field, and that's hard work.
Well, you had to hoe it back then.
Yeah.
This is before the chemicals.
Well, true. Yeah.
There was no chemicals, so today they spray for everything. That's why the tobacco is so contaminated.
Yeah.
Back then it was clean tobacco. No pesticides, nothing.
Yeah.
So what you would do is you would plant your tobacco seed in a tobacco bed, which is sterilized by burning it with logs to sterilize the soil. Plant the seed would blossom, grow a plant. You pick the plants up and you set them in the field with a tobacco setter. And then as they start to grow, you take a horse. We took a horse and with a plow would cultivate the area until the plants got so high. Then after they got pretty high, you couldn't go in there with a horse or a tractor.
Yeah.
So then you went in there with a hoe, and you'd hoe the weeds. Then you'd have to sucker it because the shoots would come off. That would suck the nutrients from the leaves of tobacco, so you'd have to sucker it. Then, of course, the worms wanted to come along. The worms wanted to get their fair share of tobacco. So then you have to go in and by hand with no gloves on, we'd pull the worms off and squish them in your hand. And then you'd have to hoe it again. And then you cultivate it, and, until it came to time to cut it. Then you cut it, put 6 plants to a stick, let it wilt in the field, put it in a wagon, put it in the barn, hang it up. When you'd hang tobacco, if you were on the top tier of the barn, it's like 130 degrees up there.
Oh,
if
yeah.
If you're in the bottom tier, you get all the dirt.
Yeah.
So you want to be hot or you want to be dirty?
So
Take your choice. So I did both ends of it. Then after it come into a case, you would pull it down, strip it, tie it in a hand, put it on a tobacco basket, take it to market and sell it.
There you go. Yeah.
Now, guys in Eastern Kentucky, they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have tractors, tobacco setters, horses. And so they would have to do it by hand, which meant the one guy told me his brother would go down to the creek and get 2 5-gallon buckets with water. And he would spear a hole in the ground, put the plant in. His brother would come along and pour a little water in it, and they'd cover it up. And that's how they would set their tobacco out.
Wow.
That's called growing tobacco by hand.
Yeah.
And we used to call us the rich Bracken County tobacco farmers.
Yeah. It's so interesting whenever you look at, I guess, history in general, and you look at how things were done differently, even in a close area. Like you think of Kentucky, you kind of get a vague view of everything Kentucky, but yet even in Kentucky, things were done differently. My best tobacco story, I guess, was when I had a football coach, and he raised tobacco, and he invited us all over. Well, he invited not all of us, just about, I don't know, there's like 3 or 4 of us. And he had his tobacco. He just planted it. It was just starting to come up, and we were just de-weeding it. And he had a plank of wood on each side, and then another plank, of course, crossing the bed. And we would have to climb up on the plank in the middle and reach out and pick out each little weed or non-tobacco plant. And I tell you, I don't think my back ever hurt worse after doing that for about 10 hours. It's definitely labor.
Well, we used to fire up some logs and drag the logs along the tobacco bed before we set the plants or the seeds. Then, but we would use horses and later a tractor.
Yes.
But our friends in Eastern Kentucky, they would do the same thing. They put chains on the logs.
Yeah.
They would drag them by hand because they didn't have a tractor or horse.
Yeah.
That's called really working hard.
Yes. Yeah.
Because those logs were heavy and they were on fire. So you had to keep your distance, and you'd pull the things. And then you put, as you said, planks on each side of the bed, and then one across to start pulling your plants. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the book a little bit more, and we can talk about it. I got a few things, I guess. Whenever I read this book, I really feel like you're in it. You put yourself in it, and oftentimes when you read a book, or at least for me, if you can connect to the person that's the author, you can really get more out of it. And I feel like you really put yourself into this one and put a lot of, I guess, your feelings, your thoughts, and passion, I guess that would be a better way to describe it. So what inspired you to write the book in the first place?
Well, around 1902, 3, 4, between 1902 and 1908, my great-grandfather, his name was George Washington Kinney. He was a tobacco buyer. A tobacco buyer was a guy who would buy tobacco from his farm guys.
Yes.
Because he had barns to house it in. Then he would hire the farmers back to process it for market. So he was known as a tobacco buyer, selling to the trust.
Yes.
Now, he had a cousin who owned the tobacco, the Kinney Tobacco Company up in Richmond, Richmond, Virginia. They were cousins. And he was associated with Buck Duke, and that's when the trusts were put together. The trusts were put together in 1890. So his cousin was a part of the trust. So Mr. Kinney was kind of slighted to that way of thinking. So he was selling to the trust. Yeah. And so the way this whole thing came about is that the trust established, when the trust came about, Buck Duke founded the American Tobacco Trust, which was a monopoly. Yeah. They controlled the sale of all tobacco products, both here and over in Europe, probably in Asia also. So they were making hundreds of millions of dollars. Oh, yeah. Doing real well. Then, before that, there was a lot of tobacco companies, manufacturers, snuff tobacco, chewing tobacco, smoking cigars, all that stuff. So the tobacco buyers from those companies would come out and bid for to buy the tobacco from the farmer. Well, they were getting anywhere from 10, 15, 20 cents a pound. Sometimes the really good stuff would bring in around 30, 35 cents a pound.
Yeah.
So the tobacco farmer is doing real well. They built a lot of mansion houses in Kentucky, Tennessee, Carolinas off of tobacco. So then what happened is, since he was a monopolist, he purchased his competition through vertical integration. That probably sounds familiar. That's what the monopolists have been doing today for the past 30, 40 years. And so they bought out all their competition. Well, now it became that he was the only buyer in town.
Yeah.
So come around 1902, when the tobacco wars started, tobacco got down to about a penny, 2 cents a pound. And you can't make any money. You can't do anything with that kind of income. And so the tobacco wars, there was 650,000 people involved, and 10,000 night riders who were the sheriff, the judge, the farmer, the merchant. They put together a vigilante group of 10,000 men. And these 10,000 men would ride through the countryside, finding farmers selling to the trust.
Yeah.
They'd pull the farmer out, horsewhipping badly, and burn down his tobacco barns. Then they would go a step further, and they'd find the warehouses in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, Covington, Kentucky, Brooksville, Kentucky, Maysville, Lexington, Cynthiana. And so they would ride through those areas, and they would make the sellers to the trust pay for their crime. And also the military was involved in trying to protect the farmer.
Yeah.
So Mr. Kinney was threatened that they threw a bundle of switches on his porch one night. He knew the next night they'd be back. Yeah. So he rode to Maysville, got the militia, or the I think it was the militia, might have been the army. Came back and sat on our farm for about a year. And then they said, Mr. Kinney, there's no night rider activity for a year. We're going to go back to Maysville. So they broke camp at first light, went back to Maysville. That night, the night riders were there, drug him out of the house, horsewhipped him, and burned down our tobacco barns. Now, the other great-grandfather, his name was George Washington Jett. He was a night rider. Yeah. And he's the one that came up and horsewhipped Grandpa George Washington Kinney. Yeah. And burned down our tobacco barns. So the daughter, Alma Jett, married his son, Tom Kinney. And after the wars were over with, I think they got married like 1915, somewhere in there. The kids were being born like my mom and aunts, uncle. Yeah. Were born 1918 to 1922, something like that.
Now, my first question comes with, were both your great grandparents still alive when the marriage happened?
They were.
They were. So that was an awkward situation. I would assume.
Mr. Jett would never talk about being a night rider. It was a secret organization. You couldn't divulge your information. But they knew it was him. Yeah. Because Mr. Kinney would say, Alma, your dad horsewhipped my dad and burned down a tobacco barns, didn't he? And she says, no, I'll not hear another word of it.
Yeah. Now, an interesting thing, this is just historical. Like you mentioned, both of their names were George Washington, and then their last name. It was a big tradition in Kentucky to name your sons after famous I guess Americans, if you want to call it that way. I've been reading this book, and I was going to bring it up a little bit later, but it's about John C.C. Mayo, and his name was John Calhoun. I forgot his middle name, but Mayo. But he was named after the Southern general. So they all, it was a big tradition. If you were favored the South, they named their sons after a Southern general or a Southern legend, if you want to say that. But if you're for the North, you went with the Northern. So you get all these names all the time that is George Washington with the last name or whatever it may be.
when George Washington became president, and
Mm-hmm.
after he beat the British,
Mm-hmm.
people were, and he did not become a king.
Yeah.
The American people were just in love with this guy
Oh yeah.
because he was our great president,
Mm-hmm.
wonderful guy. And so from tradition, say from 1800 to 1840 or 50,
Mm-hmm.
the tradition was to name their kids after George Washington.
Yeah.
And so George Washington Smith, George Washington Jones, George
You
Washington
got them
Kinney,
all. Yeah.
got them all.
Yeah.
And so he was a great, great guy.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people in a lot of people in the South, they were a lot of figures that fought with George Washington. We
Mm-hmm.
had 6 family members in the boats going across the Potomac
Mm-hmm.
to get the
Mm-hmm.
Hessians.
Yeah.
So we're very closely tied to the American Revolution.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, another question I had, and this is just goes with history, and it's just a basic history question. Oftentimes, when you look at history, you will find two sides of the story, and literally in your family, you had both sides of the story going
Yes.
on. And you mentioned that your grandfather George, that was the night rider. Correct me on the last names. Kennedy or Kinney was the farmer.
Kinney, Kinney.
Yeah.
Uh, George Washington Kinney was the tobacco buyer and
Buyer, yes.
tobacco farmer.
Mm-hmm.
And he had barns to house the tobacco in.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then he would sell directly to the trust.
Yes, yes. And when you look at this, you got one, who was wrong? Who was really wrong in this situation? Because you look at one, and he's got to sell his tobacco. He wants to sell his tobacco, so he goes with the only option he has, which is the trust. And then on the other hand, you have the other farmer or the other group of farmers who want to sell their tobacco as well, but they feel like they've been wronged by this whole trust. So it's the most interesting thing I always find with history, and you can mention on your thoughts as well, is looking in the hindsight and looking back, you kind of get to look and say, well, who was right, who was wrong? And go ahead.
The bad guy
Yeah.
was James Buck Duke.
Yeah. And
He
really,
was the bad guy.
he was the bad guy.
And he was the one. And he split the people against
Mm-hmm.
each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Selling to the trust or selling to the society.
Yeah.
The society wanted to take the tobacco and put it, warehouse it until
Mm-hmm.
the price went up.
Yeah.
But that didn't work out because there was the trust selling to the trust was creating revenues into the farmers by selling to the trust.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there was a big battle between those two things. But remember, back in those days, you had the trust, the banking trust, steel mill
Mm-hmm.
trust, mining trust, tobacco trust, oil trust, all the trust. That's where the rich guys hid their money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're a railroad guy,
Yeah.
or a steel guy, and you go on strike because you want more money because they're paying you starvation wages.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you've probably heard of the Pinkerton guys.
Mm-hmm.
The Pinkerton guys were nasty, nasty guys. I used to work with a guy named Jesse James's great nephew,
Mm-hmm.
Frank James.
Mm-hmm.
Frank James was Jesse James's brother.
Yeah.
So Frank James, that I knew, was the great grandson of Frank James.
Yeah.
And so he worked in the same company I did in St. Louis, a welding company. And so he would tell stories about the James brothers, about doing their thing back then, but they hated the Pinkerton people because the Pinkerton people would go and do the blood work for the mining trusts, the banking, the steel mill guys.
Yeah.
So what they would do is, if you refused to go to work, they would come in, the Pinkerton guys would come in with the sheriff.
Mm-hmm.
They would shoot 200 or 300 guys and kill them to put them back to work.
Yeah.
Now, the night riders, they didn't do that, but they stood up against the trust.
Mm-hmm.
I think 2 or 3 or 4 guys got killed.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, they were there to horsewhip the farmer, try to bring him into this society of not selling to the trust. Didn't work at all.
Yeah.
But that was their thing. So the mining guys, the railroad guys, and the steel mill guys, those are the ones that got punished the worst.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you're looking at Buck Duke, now he did have a influence or a part in forming Duke University, correct?
Well, he had a church down there called Trinity College.
Mm-hmm.
Trinity College was a nice school, great school, and he was putting lots of money into it. So one day he goes down to the board meeting. He says, "Hey, listen, I've been giving you guys a lot of money for a lot of years. I want you to change the name of this university from Trinity to Duke University.
Yeah.
That's how that came about.
Yeah, and I don't know about you personally, but us here in Kentucky, we don't need any other reason to not like Duke. So when I was reading this story and I saw Buck Duke come up, I was like, oh, this doesn't sound good already.
His dad, when his dad came back from the Civil War, he was a Navy guy for the Confederates. So he walked home about 130 miles out of Maryland, a prisoner of war camp. Gets home and he finds 5 barns full of tobacco.
Yeah.
The Yankees burned most of the barns down. And so here he had product. And so they decided instead of raising tobacco, they would process it. So they started their business was started in a chicken coop.
Wow.
You ever cleaned out a chicken coop as a kid?
No, but I've been in many, so I don't want to clean one out.
You missed it. You missed the hard work of cleaning out a chicken coop.
Yeah.
I did it in April and October, twice a year.
Oh.
And it was nasty.
Oh yeah.
But a lot of kids did that. That's the job the kids got.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they had a little chicken coop. That's where they started making their tobacco products. And so then it grew after that. Then over a period of years, they had a big fancy office in Fifth Avenue in New York.
Yeah.
So they did really, really well. When he died, he had $2.9 billion that his daughter inherited, Doris Duke. And I'm sure you heard stories about Doris Duke.
Yeah, that's
she was called the poor little rich girl.
Yeah. And this, I mean, you think about money wise, and that was a lot of money back then for sure. And well, the other big chapter, I guess, and this goes with, we've kind of been talking about this already anyway. You were talking about in chapter 8, it's when the little guy stands up for himself. And whenever I was reading that, and you mentioned it briefly with the coal company or the coal companies and the trust and those, but I've been reading a lot about Eastern Kentucky, and you just have so many times, even after 1900s, 2 or 3 times where you have these coal miners going on strike and just having to stand up for themselves because they're getting barely any wages. But a lot of this kind of stemmed or is similar to the tobacco situation as well. But that was just some of the things that whenever I was reading, I was like, man, this reminds me so much of the coal company, because you have these coal camps that formed up, and it was just a really rough time, rough place and you had they were just the little guys trying to do what they could.
True. This book came out of my great-grandfather's scrapbook. And as kids, we'd pull the scrapbook out from under the couch, go through it, and read about these fascinating stories about the brutality of the night riders and the resistance of the trust, and it was quite something else.
Yeah.
So then my great-grandfather, when he passed away, my grandfather got the book, Tom Kenny. When he passed away, his son got it, Tom Kenny Jr. And then he passed away, and his wife, Joanne Kenny, she got the book. So I called her up one day. I said, "Hey, Joanne, they had antiques that came down the Ohio River in flat-bottom boots after the American Revolutionary War." And I said, "Where's the antiques, Joanne?" She says, "Well, your cousins Judy, Hope, and Martha got the antiques." I said, "Well, where's all the guns Uncle Tom had?" She says, "Well, your cousin Joe got all the guns." I said, "Well, okay. Where's the Night Rider book?" She says, "Jimmy, you get the Night Rider book." And so we have it, and that's where the story came from.
Well, that's really cool. That's I've been doing these histories and looking into like county by county histories, and to have a piece of history like you have of your great grandfather's journal, or what you call it, journal or diary, or?
No, what he did is he went to the store, and back in those days, this was a clothing manufacturer out of Cincinnati.
Yeah.
They sent out these big catalogs, and they were big.
Yeah.
And so he got one of those catalogs, and then he started cutting the newspaper articles of the day out and putting them in the scrapbook.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And that's how we got the scrapbook.
Wow. Okay. That's really in my mind, that's really valuable because you get the firsthand account of what was going on.
But if you go through Kentucky or
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee or Virginia or West Virginia, that's how people kept their logs in those days. They would clip the newspaper articles out, and they would keep them in the scrapbook. That was their that was their videos.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of a picture book.
Well, I've read a few of these older ones and it's so funny. It's their Facebook. They'll have an excerpt that'll say Mount Vernon, and then it'll have like all the things that happened at Mount Vernon. Johnny went over to see Annie for the day, or Sally's cousin Sue is visiting for the week, or whatever. And then you'll have Houstonville or Lexington, and it'll be just these little columns of all these little places, and it's just like I just compare it to their Facebook. That's what it was.
Well, I get the Bracken County News, always have, and they still do that in the Bracken County News out of Brooksville, Kentucky. It's still there, on who visited who. But then they take the articles looking back, and that's exactly what you said is how those things were written back then. And then in the Bracken County News, they put through historic events of the past 1700s, 1800s, what happened in those days. So that was the communication of the people at the time.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. My mom has a bunch of she's looked at a lot of genealogy and all that, and she has a whole bunch of information about just our lineage, if you want to call it that. And I'm in. I believe I'm bought in. I'm gonna be inheriting all of her stuff, I believe, from her research and that stuff. So
that's valuable stuff. It needs to be protected.
It is.
So we keep the scrapbook locked up.
Yeah, I would in a fireproof place.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, because when you look back at these county histories, like whatever county it may be, and you mentioned this in the Civil War, they went around and burned all these courthouses, and that so much was lost. Lincoln County, which is where I live now, its courthouse was never burnt. And you just get so much information looking back at all those old documents. And you take a different, I think Rockcastle County, its courthouse didn't burn in the Civil War, but it burned in the 1870s or something like that. But man, I could just yell at the Civil War troops that went around burning all the courthouses. Like, come on, what are you doing it for?
That was terrible what they did.
Yeah.
It was a terrible war.
Yeah, it was. But on both sides, and you would have one side who would go burn the courthouse, and the other side would be like, well, we're going to burn this courthouse. And it didn't do anything. No good came from it at all.
No. Now, the hero in this whole thing, there is a hero.
Yes.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes. Go ahead, finish up.
Teddy Roosevelt was known as the Trust Buster. Now, again, there was many trusts back in the day. There was the Ice Cream Trust, the Ice Trust, the Leather Trust. A lot of them. And that's where the rich guys could kind of store their money and kept it safe. Of course, this is before the Fed. So Teddy Roosevelt comes along because the night riders are out there doing their thing, and the military gets involved. So everyone's involved in this terrible war.
Yeah.
So then Teddy Roosevelt with the Supreme Court, they break up the trust. And I think it was 1911, December 1911, John D. Rockefeller goes before the Supreme Court. And after he had a trial, maybe 6 months before that or so, or a few months before that, and he said, I started this industry on my own. No one else was in it. I developed the oil business. We created this business, and we've done very, very well. And the Supreme Court judge said, that may be true, sir, but you've created a monopoly. A monopoly stifles competition, stifles entrepreneurship, and you are now to sell your company off within 6 months, every bit of it. So he did. Then that afternoon, they bring in Buck Duke. Same story.
Yeah.
I have developed a company, a technology from nothing, from nowhere. It's mine that I developed. You have no right to take this away. The judge said, you will sell it off in 6 months, and it better all be sold off in 6 months. So each company, both the oil trust and the tobacco trust, they split off to about 6 or 8 different companies.
Yeah.
ExxonMobil, Shell, and a whole bunch of other ones. And then the Buck Duke had Benson and Hedges and about 6 different companies.
Yeah.
But when they sold them off, they still had ownership. They had shares in it. They both made far more money sold off into private industries than they ever would have made on their own.
Oh no, yeah.
And so now we come up to today with Facebook, Google, Apple, all those guys who are monopolists.
Yeah.
Now, what they have is they have, through vertical integration, have purchased 50, 75, 100, even 200 companies that got their vertical integration up to create monopolies. And so the FBI is investigating, and so is the Department of Justice investigating how these monopolies were able to come about. And so I say that Trump is going to be the guy who's going to bust up the monopolies this time. Because one thing was stated about the monopolies, if you are a monopolist and you control everything, you stifle competition, you stifle entrepreneurship and capitalism, and it's illegal in this country to have a monopoly.
Yeah.
And that came from the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which should be upgraded to today.
True.
So,
it's a very good book and very good read. 2 things I really enjoyed, and especially, and even at the end, that I really thought were very good history quotes and just stories in general. You mentioned the 2 girls at the end of the book when you were walking down and bought the lemonade off of them, and then like years later they came back and they were like, "Hey, we remember you." and I bring that up just as a personally, you never know what kind of impact you're going to have on somebody, and to always make sure it's a good positive one, and because it can always go on to like you said, funnel or grow the seed of entrepreneurship or just whatever it may be in those situations. So I really enjoyed that story. Have you been in contact with those? Did you tell them they're in the book, I guess?
No, they don't know they're in the book. But when I was leaving the house, the girls had a lemonade stand out in front of at the end of their driveway. And so I stopped and I bought lemonade from them. Now, their mom was standing up in the garage and watching, which she should have done.
Yeah.
And so I said, girls, you're what they call capitalists and entrepreneurs. You bought this ingredients to make this product that I'm buying.
Yeah.
And then you get money, and that's called capitalism and entrepreneurship. I said, so when you grow up, you want to become a capitalist and entrepreneur. So 10 years later, maybe 12 years later, I've been longer than that. It's Halloween time. They come knocking on the door, and I step out, and they said, "Mom, there's the guy that taught us how to be capitalists and entrepreneurs." And her dad says, "Wow." So they didn't forget.
Yeah.
So now they're teenagers in high school. And so capitalism and entrepreneurship is the only way that this country can function. Socialism will not work.
Yeah.
Socialism was Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin. They all tried socialism, and they were able to kill 100 million people in the last century.
Yeah, those are rough stories, rough history for sure.
Well, look at Argentina right now. How bad a shape that's in.
Yeah, they've got.
They used to be a richer country than America. Now
you bring up Argentina too, and I bring this up just because I recently was it 1893 or 1897 when the Panic of 1893 I think was, and it was Argentina who caused that panic. Like I think their infrastructure or whatever, something happened. I just read about it and it's lost me. But now, and I think after that is when they began to adopt the socialist kind of
let's say up to around 1900. They were very wealthy, very rich. They held the oil industry. They're doing very, very well.
Yeah.
And then I forget who the guy was who was the guy in charge, but then they lost it to a socialist guy, and then he took it down.
Yeah.
And now you got a terrible thing down there.
Yeah.
And if you saw the news articles about maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, President Trump, along with the military, was going after those guys. They got warrants out for their arrest. The president, his 2 cronies, and there's 15 support people that they're trying to arrest. So they put the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, and the Coast Guard in charge to go get them. So they put a huge fleet out in the Atlantic to capture the drug runners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's public information now.
Yeah, yeah. Now, well, let's see. I got another question. I want to save your history quote to the end. But the one question, you bring up Trump, and you talk about in chapter 11, you talked about his poll numbers and all this, and you mentioned how when they take the polls, a lot of people agree with what he's doing, but yet the poll numbers then switch over and they disapprove of him. And this is just me, trying to be neutral in all aspects. But do you think that if he didn't use Twitter, that would kind of change things? Do you think that, is that do you think a fair analysis to say if he just didn't use Twitter, then his approval as far as him as a person would be better?
No, I
Nope.
think him using Twitter is fabulous. He's transparent. It's open.
Yeah.
He says what he thinks, and it goes out there. The people know what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
So he does not let the news media control what he says, because the news media would walk all over him if it wasn't for Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they try to walk all over him now. But the news media is the pit bull for the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so they use the mainstream news media to put out the left side of the voice,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Bernie just dropped out here, yesterday?
It was yesterday, yes.
Yeah, it was yesterday. He believes in communism and socialism, and we can't have that in this country. You'd have the elitists would control everything, and then we'd be the slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Democratic Party is after. They've gone completely left
mm-hmm.
over this past since Trump has been in office.
Mm-hmm. And just me personally, I feel like if there's just more people that would come to the middle ground, I think that would help out a lot as far as the divisiveness that we have, I guess, in our country at the moment. If we just had more people that would just come to the middle, a lot more would get done. But I feel like we have people on the left, the people on the right, and like they do not want to give an inch or take an inch at all. They're afraid.
We're split.
They're afraid that if you give an inch, the other side's going to take a mile, and it doesn't need to be that way. In my idea, the middle road is the road everybody needs to kind of come to, but
it's not that way. It's not that way now.
It's not.
No.
Well, before we get too much into a political discussion, let's wrap this author interview up. I thank you again for coming on. I've really enjoyed talking about the history and the connection you have to the tobacco wars. Whenever we first reached out and I saw tobacco wars in Kentucky, I was like, man, I need to know about this. This is very interesting. And I had no clue. And that's one of the great things about looking into history. And I want to quote you here, because you say this quote and you say there's nobody who quoted it. So I'm quoting you. You say history is nothing more than a line of dominoes. Every historical event is the cause of and the result of some other event. And I think that's very true. That's about as true as you can get when it comes to history.
One more thing.
Yes.
When the tobacco trusts were broken up,
mm-hmm.
the rich guys got on a train at midnight in
mm-hmm.
New York City and went down to Jekyll Island.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Dukes. They
mm-hmm.
sat there for 3 years, from 1910 to about 1913, figuring
mm-hmm.
out how they're going to save their money. What they did is they formed a corporation called the Fed, the Federal Bank,
mm-hmm.
and the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to manipulate the Congress and the Senate to pass that law.
Mm-hmm.
And so they passed a law that was unconstitutional. It's still in existence today. It needs to be broken up.
Mm-hmm.
The last guy to try to break it up was Kennedy. He got
mm-hmm.
shot and killed.
Mm-hmm.
And now Trump is the guy that could break that up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
now, as we wrap up, this book here, you can get it on Amazon, Walmart, Barnes & Noble. You can get it about anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also go to the tobaccowars.com and you can order it there as well. And I hear you've been putting up some videos or audios about that as well. Is that correct?
Well, this interview we're having now will be on our webpage.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think, will be the 6th or 7th one that we've done. And that's on the webpage.
Yeah.
So it's about several, all you guys I've talked to, very knowledgeable, very nice. We've had a good time doing the shows.
Yeah.
So that's all recorded and on our webpage.
You can check all those out at tobaccowars.com. And also, if you want to follow the Tobacco Wars on Twitter, you can go to @TobaccoWars, and you can get a bunch of updates and posts there as well. With that being said, if you're an author and you want to come on to Tech History Podcast, feel free to come out and contact us, and we will have you on the show. There's only one stipulation, and that is it has to pertain to Kentucky in some sort of form. So with that being said, Mr. Rumford, anything you want to add at the end?
Yes. And Bracken County has fabulous history. Okay. Every county in Kentucky has fabulous history, stories that need to be told. Kentucky is full of fabulous history on what happened, how it was developed, who came there, and did the things that we now have a heritage to. So what you're doing, keep it up, because I'm proud of you for moving in that direction, because you've got something that's a big job ahead of you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook at KY History Pod, and you can also email us at thelandbetweenthemeadow@gmail.com. Mr. Rumford, thank you for coming on, and it's been great.
Well, thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, take care of yourself.